Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
And Gini, as they say on Family Feud, survey says.
Is that show still on? I think it is.
I believe
isn't
it is.
Yeah.
I believe it is because I see little reels that pop up in my Facebook and Instagram occasionally with funny moments from it.
Survey says.
Survey says. I don't know that they say survey says anymore, but
we just showed our age.
Yes.
Okay.
But it is what it is. I mean, there's probably been 3 or 4 hosts since.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I don't remember who that was who did that, but anyway, very distinctive. In any case, we will stop making ourselves look and sound old, and instead we will talk about the SAGA quarterly survey because once again we have talked with small agency owners to see what they're thinking and what their outlook is for the next 12 months. And on top of that, we took a deep dive on talent questions, so compensation, retention, recruiting, those kinds of things, so that we have a little bit of an understanding of how they're approaching the labor side of the equation in their businesses, because the more we learn about each other, the more useful that we can be, or the more productive we can be.
And it's super interesting. There's a couple of things in here that are a little bit mind-blowing that I think we need to talk about.
Yes, there are certainly some things in here. I mean, the overall outlook seems to be positive, although, once again, very similar numbers to what we saw in Q3 in terms of overall satisfaction with their business and anticipation of revenue and profit increases in the coming 12 months. Just as it was in Q3, I'm not entirely sure of why there is this optimism and this satisfaction. It is certainly something that, I mean, look, I think there are potentially good things on the horizon. So there is. I'm not saying it's an irrational optimism. At the same time, I suspect, and as we dig into some of these the talent questions, we'll see that a lot of agencies cut back their headcount over the last 12 months. So in part, some of the optimism might be, we can't get any worse, right? So it's got to be better. It's got to improve. And so that may be driving some of that optimism. But the overall satisfaction, the score was 6.94 out of on a 10-point scale. So that's not terrible. I mean, it's not overall excited satisfaction with their businesses, but it's not dissatisfaction either.
Yes, but as you also point out, that about 20% rate their satisfaction at 5 or below, which is some real concerns. But I thought it was really interesting because only 1% expected to reduce their team size, which is a drop from 11% in Q3. So that's a good indication that maybe things are starting to stabilize a little bit.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, I think that's probably the best piece of data that we saw there was that there was no longer, because what we commented on in Q3 was, there's optimism that revenue and profits are going to increase, but people are talking about holding steady on their headcount or even reducing. And so, that was concerning because that suggests that they're going to try to balance the books on the backs of the employees.
Right.
The fact that there's no longer an inclination to reduce, at least. I mean, we're not seeing people, saying we expect to increase either, but the fact that they've moved off of decreasing headcount is certainly a good sign. I think, and something worth noting.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is, there is some optimism. It is tempered by the fact that while we're not going to reduce our staff size, we're not necessarily going to increase it either. So there's some optimism to increase revenue and profits a little bit. There's some optimism in terms of not having to let people go, but there's also, it's tempered, I think, a little bit by saying, yeah, but we're probably not going to be adding people either.
Right. But I think the really interesting stuff comes when we start digging into some of these talent questions.
Yes.
And so and the talent, by the way, includes the owner. So we've got some things about owner comp that we need to talk about here as well. But one of the things that I think feeds into what we were talking about as far as the overall outlook is that 1 in 3 of small agencies have reduced their headcount in the past 12 months. So when you start to see they've already been cutting numbers in substantial percentages, that suggests one of the potential reasons why they may not plan on reducing any further. And so, They may have weeded out the issues that they had from a cost perspective. Maybe they're improving their profit numbers, and so that's causing them to feel like they're in a better position for the year ahead. So certainly it's been a tough 12 months. There's no doubt
Yeah.
about it, and
Yep.
longer than that, really.
Yep.
But the survey looks particularly at the last 12 months. And as we look at that I think informs some of what else is going on that's even more troubling, particularly when we look at owner comp,
Mhm.
because 1 in 5 small agency owners doesn't pay themselves regularly at all. They just take money out of profits as and when they can. And what's it? I think about 39% are paying themselves under $100,000 a year.
39%
Yeah.
are paying themselves less than $100,000. That's not okay.
No, in fact, more agencies, I think I'm correct in saying this, or saying it correctly, more than half of agencies have at least one employee who's making over 100,000.
Nope.
Less than half pay themselves over 100,000 on a consistent basis. Now, that doesn't mean that they may not be harvesting that out of profits, by doing a big dump here or there, but you've got to be paying yourself consistently. And really, I think just about every agency owner out there could go and get a 6-figure job.
Yeah.
I won't say easily, but without a huge amount of difficulty. And so why are you taking on all the risk and stress if you're not compensating yourself for that risk and stress?
Why exactly? Like, why are you doing this? I say this to my clients all the time. If you were to go get a job with your level of expertise, your number of years of experience, and what your skill that you offer to an organization, how much money do you think you could command? And there's usually some hemming and hawing. And I really push this. I'm like, really and truly, what do you think? And if they can't give me an answer, I do a screen share and we pull up job descriptions and we look to see if you took this job, here's the range. And it's always 6 figures, always. And the person's paying themselves like 50 grand a year or 45 grand a year. Why are you doing this? Because you have all the risk. You're putting everything into it. You should be paying yourself a living wage, and an employee should not be making more money than you do. Now, is it honorable that you want to make sure that your employees are paid? Absolutely. But they should not be making more money than you make. So you've got to figure that piece out. You have to.
Yeah, because look, even if you're doing it because you're like, well, I got a talented team, I need to keep them around, it's tough times and all of that. The reality is that if you're not making measurably more than your highest paid employee, you will end up resenting them. It may not be in those first 3 months, but over time, you will come to it's human nature. You can't sit there and think, I own this business. I'm struggling to meet payroll, and yet I'm paying you more than I'm paying myself. It is not a healthy place to be. You're unlikely to make good business decisions when you're in that position, and particularly because the owners in the survey, they're not paying themselves well, and about 40% of them are paying themselves less now than they did a year ago.
No.
So they're not paying themselves enough to begin with. They're cutting their pay, and yet most of them are reporting that they gave raises comparable to what they've been giving in the past to their teams. Again, admirable. I love that you feel that way about your teams and you're trying to be helpful to them. But ultimately, that's not a healthy business choice, because it's not like you're making $10 million a year and you took a pay cut to $8 million, right?
Right.
I mean, if you're the CEO of a giant company and you take that kind of pay cut to be symbolic, whatever, fine.
Right.
But when you're making $80,000, you start paying yourself $60,000 because that's how you can come up with the money to give raises or bonuses or to keep an employee around. That's not healthy.
No.
And so you really need to be thinking about these things as you go into the next 12 months and thinking about, how do I make sure I'm paying myself a fair salary for the work that I'm doing? And remember, we always talk about this. You need to have 2 revenue streams from your business personally. One is your compensation for the work you're doing because you are an employee of the business. And you also need to have a profit stream separate and apart from that. And that's for your risk taking as an entrepreneur. And if you don't have those 2 revenue streams, you're not building a healthy business, and you're not ultimately building something that I think you will be satisfied with 5 or 10 years down the road.
And you aren't building something that if your goal is to sell it eventually, you won't be able to, because it won't be there. The numbers won't be accurate, and you won't have been paying yourself And so there's all of those things that go into it as well. So I love the idea of thinking about it from the perspective of a salary as an employee and then profit as the risk taker. And so the salary as an employee is a non-negotiable, just like it's a non-negotiable for any other employee that you have. The profit sharing, now that piece is, up to you, whether or not you're bidding projects or retainers appropriately, whether or not you're actually making a profit. All of those things come into play. So you can start to work on, gosh, I'd really like to have more profit come into my bank account. Then you can start working on the things that you need to increase that. But the salary is a non-negotiable. You have to pay yourself at least what you would be able to make somewhere else.
Right.
Or that
and
if you had somebody come to you and buy the company, they would say, are you making enough money? Like if we replace you, how much would we have to pay a CEO of this business to replace you? That's what you should be paying yourself.
And that's one of the big gotchas that a lot of agency owners have when they start thinking about selling the business, and something that is always tough to explain to an owner, particularly if they're in the position of, I want to sell now, and they haven't been thinking about this, because they think that they've got $200,000 in profit because that's what they put in their own pocket. And the reality is that no acquirer is going to look at it that way. They're going to assign part of that $200,000 to salary and part of that to profit. And all of a sudden your profit is now in the toilet. And so what you thought you were worth, you are not. And before anybody starts emailing and commenting and ranting, well, my accountant told me not to pay myself a salary for tax purposes. I'm not talking about that. When I say salary, it's just fixed compensation. However your accountant tells you to do that. It could be a guaranteed income. It could be salary. It could be just regular draws that you take on clockwork and you've got allocated on paper and in your mind as compensation for the work you do versus profits. I don't care how you do it. Absolutely do it in the most tax efficient way possible. Right. And that will be different based on how your business is structured and where you're located. Even two very similarly structured agencies in two different states, they have to pay it differently, right? You can be an S corp in one state and an S corp in another state, and your accountants will tell you that you need to either pay yourself a generous salary or not. Whatever. Do what they tell you to do, but you still need to have in your mind and on paper a proper salary for the work that you're doing, however you account for it.
Yeah. Like I said, it's a non-negotiable, and it's shocking that 1 in 5 in the survey, 1 in 5 don't pay themselves a regular salary, opting to instead to draw from profits. Okay. If you don't have profit, then that means you make zero, which sucks. Among those who do pay themselves, fewer than half reported earning 6-figure salaries, and 39% acknowledged reducing their pay over the past year. The thing about it is that they've, to your point, it's admirable because they've reflected a commitment to rewarding their teams, but it's hurting you. It's hurting you. It's hurting your business. It's hurting your future ability to be able to do the right things. It's hurting any ability to be able to sell in the next 3 to 5 years. If that's a goal, like, you have to really think about these things. And it's not just in the here and now. And listen, it's been a crappy year. It's been a crappy 2 years. I get it. But you have to figure out how you can pay yourself first and then build your business around that.
Right. And I think there's other data in the survey that points to small agencies perhaps not structuring themselves appropriately, either because they're not pricing correctly, they don't have efficient processes in place, those sorts of things. Because, when we look at the data, 1 out of 3 small agencies are having their employees work overtime at least monthly.
Oof.
And so if at least 1 out of every 4 weeks your team is being asked to work overtime, that's a problem. That really suggests that you have a problem in terms of how you're resourcing for the work that you're doing, which usually is because you're not pricing it enough. And so you have to find a way to squeeze out as much labor as you can. And at first blush, you sit there and say, well, it's only once a month. Right? And that doesn't sound like that much, but that's 25% of the time, right? There's 4 weeks in most months.
Right.
And if at least 1 out of the 4, they're working more than 40 hours a week, typically, that's a problem. And I know that most of us grew up in a world where we worked more than 40 hours a week every week. When I started out in agency world, that's what everybody did.
Sure.
And that's why agencies have such a bad reputation.
Yes.
And you can't build your business expecting that that's going to be the way that you do things. It doesn't mean that it won't happen from time to time. Like, I'm not saying that you should never have employees work
Right.
more than 40 hours a
Right.
week. There's
Right.
always, but it ought to be rare. It shouldn't be part of your usual regular practice, because that makes it harder to retain your employees, particularly today, particularly where people are valuing, work-life balance much more. And they've seen the way things can be, and they want it that way. And we can sit here and say, well, that's not the way we did it. We don't think it's right. You just need to buckle down and do it and pay your dues and all. You can say that all you want. Good luck in being able to staff consistently at a
Yeah.
high level if that's your approach.
Yeah. And I will tell you that the younger generation, Gen Z, will not have it. They're like, yeah, no, I'm not doing it. So figure it out, because this is not the way of the world anymore. And yes, you and I are of the generation that we did. And 100-hour work weeks were not uncommon. But that's not how things work anymore. And the fact that if you think that you're going to build a business, to use a phrase that you use all the time, on the backs of your employees, you've got another thing coming. You've got to figure this out, because that's not, anybody that's younger than that's probably 35 or younger is not going to work that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, working overtime should be because something legitimately came up that was
Yes.
out of the ordinary,
Yes.
an emergency of some
Yep.
kind.
Yep.
It shouldn't be, that's the only way we can do this work profitably or even minimally profitably. You've got to be thinking about those kinds of things. And we see that, I mean, of the small agencies in the survey, every single one of them is either remote or hybrid. There wasn't a single respondent that said that they had gone to fully in-office work again.
Interesting.
And so that, it surprised me a little bit that not one was an all in-office agency, because they are out there. There aren't very many anymore, but they are out there, and we are certainly seeing bigger businesses who are trying to force their employees back into the office.
Yep.
Usually with a lot of resistance. But the fact that employees are now mostly remote entirely or hybrid, and the survey also showed that you're also giving them a lot of flexibility to define what their hours are, when they come into the office and when they don't. Most agencies are not saying, this is our set schedule in the office or out of the office. Even when you're remote, not saying it's got to be exactly 9 to 5 so that you're aligned with the rest of the team. Most are giving flexibility. And that's great. But just because you're giving that flexibility doesn't mean that you can also say, oh, and by the way, you've also got to work 45, 50 hours a week on a regular basis.
Right.
So be consistent in trusting your employees. Be consistent in finding ways to help them. And frankly, with most agencies giving raises and doing them at or near previous levels, frankly, a lot of employees would be maybe not just as happy, but they would be very happy if they were not being asked to work overtime, right?
Yep.
And we consistently hear from employees that they're more interested in that work-life balance than they are in how much is going into their bank account every 2 weeks. Doesn't mean they don't care about it, but if you ask them to rate the relative significance, oftentimes it's the amount of time spent and not the actual compensation.
Absolutely. That and the flexibility, giving them flexibility. Like, don't say they have to be sitting at their desk for 10 hours a day, and making sure that they are, like, giving them the flexibility to be able to go to the doctor's appointment in the middle of the day, or running to the DMV to renew their driver's license, whatever it happens to be. But that, I think those two things are really, really important. And so if you're thinking about, how do I make sure that I'm going to have a consistent paycheck for myself, or how am I going to give raises and bonuses? Perhaps the quote unquote raise or bonus is not monetary, it's not financial, but it's in more flexibility or the ability to do things that they're not able to do right now. I mean, there are lots of things that we do for my team that, we don't necessarily pay for. We close the last 2 weeks of the year every year. Nobody has to take their PTO for that. And that people love that. They love that. We have the whole week of Thanksgiving we're closed. They love that. They don't have to take their PTO. You know how much money that costs me? Nothing. And people are willing to give up a bonus, a year-end bonus, because they get 3 extra weeks off. So there are things that you can do to ensure that you're getting yourself paid and being able to keep your employees happy too.
Yeah, and I think if you take a look at some of the other data in the survey, there's also, I mean, we've only really skimmed the surface of what it covers when it comes to talent. But I think if you start looking into it, there are a lot of things that you can do in terms of helping your employees with benefits, helping your employees with improving their skill sets. A lot of things that you can do that don't cost necessarily a lot of money. Even things like, the survey showed that only about 80% of agencies with full-time employees are providing health insurance as a benefit. That was a little surprising to me that it wasn't higher. And I get that health insurance is expensive, but you can provide health insurance even if you're not subsidizing it at all.
Yep.
And I would encourage you to, at a minimum, make it available to your employees if you can, even if you're not offering even if they have to pay 100% of it, because it's a way to access something that is different from what they can get in the public exchanges, which, depending on where someone lives, may have some good choices, may not. And so, I think that there are creative ways that you can go about these things, even when you're afraid of the cost of things, to do them creatively in such a way that it helps your team. And all of those things will help with retention. And if you dig into the data, it shows what percentage of employees are leaving to go to agencies versus other places, who's going to work for clients, what percentage of agencies have had to do layoffs or have had to terminate employees for all sorts of stuff in there that I think will help you to gain some additional perspective on your own teams and your own policies and practices.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the one non-negotiable is you have to pay yourself a salary, and the rest of it is there to help you figure out what you should be thinking about for next year, especially the first quarter. And it does seem like things are starting to stabilize a little bit, so that is good news, but approach it with some cautious optimism.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how the first quarter of next year develops and where things go from there, because in the first quarter, we'll be looking back at overall performance of the agency in the past calendar year and look at some bigger trends like that. So really looking forward to that as well. But I would encourage you to download a copy of the results. They're available for free at smallagencygrowth.com, and you can dig into them and see what you might find in there that would be useful to your own business and give you some ideas for what you might do with your own teams.
Absolutely. Go study it.
So with that will draw to a close this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And it depends.